everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is my regular series on Thursdays where we talk about making music. We talk about composing, arranging, improvisation, playing by ear, all the different creative aspects of music. And as we've been doing for the last couple months, we're tracking what's going on in our basic music theory course, which is getting close to wrapping up. Next week is the last official week of that. It's not like we'll never talk about basic theory anymore, but as far as the actual coursework and the actual things that we're going through on kind of a planned basis, we wrap up next week. So today we're going to be talking about chords, and next week we'll kind of morph into talking about chords as they relate to melody and sort of use this as sort of a launching into other areas as well. So what I want to do is visit the project, and I also, even people who aren't in the actual course, I did put in the newsletter, right? Talked about what we're doing. We're looking at the Bach prelude in C, right? That guy, that one, which it's a pretty familiar one, right? It's pretty familiar to I think even if you're a pianist, it's like often a piece you learn sometime in your first couple of years, and because it's the easiest to play of all the Bach preludes and fugues in well-tempered clavier, but it also works really well for analysis purposes. So I'm going to flip over and we're going to take a look at this piece. I have it loaded into MuseScore here, and then we're also going to, let me actually close up the side panels in here so that we have a little more working room, and there we go. But so a couple of people have tried their hand at some analysis here, and I'm going to look at Graham's. Graham, you posted an analysis here, which I took a brief look at. We'll look at this in a little more detail. It's currently set not to be downloadable, so I can't actually download yours and load it into MuseScore, but we can view it on the website, and that's fine. But before I get deep into Graham's full analysis, I do want to address something that came up, because we're also using this in the what am I talking about? We're using this in for a notation project, right? To get practice just entering into MuseScore. And in that project here, Rod made an interesting typo here. And then the little discussion came up about whether this is actually an improvement or not. So we're going to talk about this. Let's talk about this. This directly, if we look at the comment that I put in the analysis project, I said, each measure is a different chord. They are all simple arpeggios with few, if any, missing or added notes, except the second to last bar. There's actually a couple others other than that, but the second to last bar is the one that we're going to be talking about here. And I said, ignore the C and the bass for now. So this is exactly what I wanted to talk about anyhow. And so it's sort of interesting that it ended up being the source of a little bit of a typo here. So the typo here consisted of, if I look at the actual score, I'm going to go look at the actual score and we'll talk about how it ends. I'm going to play starting here, measure 30. And since I can play this, is really easy to sight read. Now I'm on measure 33 here. Now what am I doing? Now that is what we're talking about. So we are talking about this measure right here. So the question is, what was Bach thinking here? You know, is this a good choice? So this chord, if we just look at the right hand, I mean, that is G7, right? That is the 5 chord. That's just a plain, nice arpeggio of that G7 chord. And then That E is what we call a passing tone, just to kind of fill the gap between the F and D to create stepwise melody. I've got a couple more lessons next week where we'll talk more about that sort of thing. But in the left hand, we have a C, which does not belong in that chord, right? And then it goes up to the B. So we have this C sounding while we're hearing a G7 chord. This is dissonant as all get out, right? I mean, this is not consonant, but it's incredibly stylistically appropriate. We could go through the well-tempered clavier here, and I could look at the in fact, oh, I deleted it from here. But the yeah, I used to have the fugue up here, and you all can see it too. It's like all this stuff going on in the fugue in the last few measures. In fact, I can pull it up in the PDF. If we look at the fugue that goes with this, let's take a look at the actual PDF here. Come on, PDF. All right, PDF doesn't want to display. But yeah, almost every single one of Bach's preludes, or certainly the fugues, not necessarily the preludes, but most of them do exactly that. And this is called pedal point. This is the term for this thing where you keep a note sounding while changing chords above it. It's called pedal point specifically. I don't know why the PDF seems to have just disappeared here, right? I mean, that used to be there. Don't know why it's not showing. But obviously you were able to access it at one point to start doing this thing. So that's called pedal point. The idea, and it's called pedal point because on an organ, that would literally be a pedal, right? You slap your foot down on that low C and then hold it there while your hands do other stuff on top of it. Bach did that to conclude many of his fugues. It's just super common. So the C major one does it. If I randomly flip to another page here and take a look at the next fugue, I'm skipping. Yeah, this one doesn't do it, but whatever. Many of his fugues do that. Okay, Graham, great. You've got the link here now where I can maybe get to it. Ah, lovely. And can I download it now? Yes, now I can download it. Yay. Nope, I can't. So you must have set it to not download for some reason. And yeah, I know that website occasionally does glitches, and even if you didn't set it to not download, it's just not letting me download it. So we're going to look at it on the website, but we will be accessing it otherwise. So anyhow, that is pedal point. So sorry to be kind of scattered and flipping around, but I wanted to talk about that pedal point. It's the one, the tonic. This is what's called a tonic pedal, where you keep the tonic, the one, in the bass, and then there's like a 4 chord here happening, and then a 5/7 chord there. We have these chords changing harmonically, following all sorts of normal harmonic principles on top, while holding on to the tonic in the bass. Tonic pedals are very common, as are dominant pedals. Is something where you have the 5 pedaling in here. Though he wouldn't have used those chords over a dominant pedal because they don't sound so good. But tonic pedals and dominant pedals, either the 1 or the 5, are both super common. All right, so what I'm going to do now is, so that is absolutely correct. That is what Bach wrote, and it would have been very out of character for Bach not to have put this pedal point in here. But what Rod did is changed it to a B. So instead of C to B, it's B to B. And the question was, well, is that better? So I'm not going to say we're going to improve on Bach, but let's talk about why Bach would or would not have done that, okay? This, putting the leading tone doubled in octaves down here, and then putting a whole chord above it here, it's very leading tone heavy. That's a lot of leading tone. There's kind of a rule in music theory that says, maybe don't double the leading tone so much. It's not like you can never double it, not like an entire orchestra, only one person is playing the leading tone. But, there's certain principles about how much leading tone is going to be perceived as too much. And that to me is too much leading tone. That sounds like a lot of B. So when I hear that, I do not hear that as an improvement. Now, G. That would be lovely. I can reach that 10th, barely. Bach would not have written that, though, because he didn't tend to write that kind of stretchy. If this was Rachmaninoff, he totally would have written that. Rachmaninoff thinks everyone can reach 10ths. He's wrong, but he thought everyone could reach a 10th, or he just didn't care and just wrote 10ths like crazy. So maybe this. So old organ pedals, how low they go, I don't know. I couldn't tell you how many octaves. There's probably, as today, lots of different models of organs, and there was less standardization in the past than there is now, but organs are one of the least standardized instruments that exists right now. And so old organs, I would assume, were also not standardized. Now, if Allison were here, she could probably tell us, because she's got a lot of historic insight, but I know she's got no internet connection for the next couple of weeks. But if anyone else has any insight into the range of the organ pedals, I'd love to hear about it. So in any case, yeah, that doubled leading tone here would not be a thing. Bach would not have done that. And also, doubling it and then resolving both of those Bs to C in the next measure, that would be called parallel octaves. And that's another thing that you don't typically do. They're related. That's part of why you don't double the leading tone more than you need to, because those leading tones are all going to want to go to the tonic. And then if you double them all, you get this thing of what's called parallel octaves. And it's important to note that Bach is very consistent throughout this piece of there's two voices in the left hand. And if you follow each one of them, here's the dominant pedal, right? He's got dominant pedal going all throughout this section. Right? More G, more G, more G, more G, more G, more G with tension, more G, right? That's dominant pedal. So yeah, Bach does use a long dominant pedal in this piece. So yeah, that idea of doubling the leading tone there wouldn't happen. But if I look at another passage that's not about pedal point, you'll see that the two different notes in the left hand here, if you think of them as separate voices, there's really nice voice leading. And voice leading is a subject we'll also talk a little bit more about next week. But we've talked about it before. It's the idea of connecting notes. So if you just follow the top note of the two in the bottom staff, A flat, G, F, F, D, and then it goes into the pedal point, E. It's not pedal point yet. That's a nice smooth melody. And if you also follow the bottom notes, F, 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 E, 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 D, D, and then there's a leap, G, G, C. That leap is following the circle of fifths, and I talked about that as well. It was at this week's newsletter, I don't remember, but that circle of fifths thing, D, the 2 chord, to G, the 5 chord, to the C. So you're often going to see those leaps of a fifth, or either a fifth down or a fourth up. They're going to be super common in the bass range there, because you're going to want to leap along the circle of fifths like that. But other than those circle of fifth leaps, you'll see that the voice leading is all very smooth. And so there's a lot of attention to these as two different voices doing two different things and resolving independently. So it would have been very out of character for Bach in this final measure to give you two Bs in the same voice and then move them both the same way. That just isn't not something Bach likely would have done. So I don't know if the sound is cutting out for anyone else, but by all means, feel free to answer that. So Dawn is bringing up a really good point here about parallel octaves in the flutes, and this is a different concept. So what I will say is this is what we call doubling. And it's super common because in an orchestra, you got all of these people. They're not all going to play independent things. So it's very common that the first flute and the second flute will have exactly the same line an octave apart. That's not the sort of parallel octaves we try to avoid, because that's consistently, for either not necessarily the whole piece, but for a whole phrase, having it doubled in octaves. And that'll also be the case in the strings. First and second violins might do that, or the flutes might be an octave above the trumpets, both having the same melody, but split in octaves. So that type of doubling in octaves is super, super common. That's not the parallel fifths thing or parallel octaves thing. The parallel octaves are when everywhere else it's independent, and then just one place there's this weird doubling, and then they move in parallel. And it tends to stand out then because it changes the texture. It's a lovely texture, but it's not the texture that he's using everywhere else. Everywhere else, his texture is more about these independent lines, the top note and the bottom note resolving independently. So if you've established independence of two parts by having them double and then move together, you're losing that independence there. And Bach didn't do that sort of thing. And that's still the case now. Oh, I like the forest fire reference there. Yeah, so maybe the forest fire is cutting out the sound. We had the smoke here in Colorado a couple weeks ago. Now I guess those of you on the East Coast are dealing with it. So, and Stephen's observation that, yeah, if you've got good voice leading, then when I play these chords in full, this chord to this chord to this chord, I'm playing them in full. This is all good voice leading. Everything is moving in step. The F to F sharp to G. The middle line is B, C, C. And the bottom line is just G, A, G, right? So, each of the three independent lines on the top staff are moving together, and the same if we played all the bottom notes in there too. Everything would just move smoothly. So as far as a theme for today, so and for whatever reason, I don't always see who's asking what here. Yeah, we're looking at the Bach prelude in C, just kind of tracking what we're doing in basic theory. I might skip over to another piece at some point to continue the same types of observations. But yeah, we're starting by looking at the Bach prelude in C here. So let's flip over now to Graham's analysis, where he's got Roman numeral analysis in here. And so Graham, I've looked at this only a little bit. So feel free to chime in with any questions. You mentioned that you had like some questions about some diminished chords maybe not being right, and we'll see those. But let's go on the assumption that you've got most things right, because I looked at the first few, and the first few are certainly right. This is the one chord. Now this is the two chord, right? This is D minor, D, F, A, D, F, A, and C in the bottom here, in the bass. And so you're correctly calling this the two chord and using 4-2, the normal notation for that third inversion, when the seventh is in the bass. Then you've got 5-6-5, which is the 5 chord in first inversion, meaning the third is in the bass, and then back to 1. Now, 6 chord. Here, the abbreviation, I see you have 6-3 notated there. So that is correct in that first inversion is a sixth above and a third above, but we almost never notate it that way. We never notate the 6-3. We just abbreviate to just 6. I mentioned in one of the lessons rather that 4-2, sometimes we abbreviate to just 2. But most of them are pretty standardized as far as how we list them. First inversion triads are pretty much always just 6, and the 3 is omitted, even though that is the full name, because it is a sixth above and a third above. And then you're using the sort of official classical secondary dominant notation here, calling this 5 of 5. And this is true. And this is something that, you know, I might talk about a little bit more next week. But what's happening here is, first of all, the answer that I would have accepted for this as being perfectly correct according to how I've laid things out. No, 6-3 isn't wrong. It just looks weird because it's like over specific and we just don't normally do it. But it is technically correct. It's just not how it's usually done. So the 5-4-2 is absolutely correct. This is good. But I hadn't explained this yet, or only barely. So let me walk people through this. The answer that I would have totally been happy with here is just to call it capital 2, because it is a D triad with a C in it. So it is 2, 7, and a capital 2, capital Roman numeral 2, 7. That would be a completely accurate description of that chord, because it is a chord based on scale degree 2. It does have a major triad in it, so we spell it with a capital, and then you put a 7 on it, or actually 4-2, because it's an inversion. So capital 2, 4-2 would be completely correct. For people who haven't seen this notation before, Graham's going a step ahead here and noticing that anytime there is a chord that is not diatonic, meaning it's got accidentals in the chord, there's usually a reason for it to exist. And traditionally, when we're doing Roman numeral analysis, we don't just put a capital 2 there to say, hey, it's a dominant 7-2 chord. We put in a notation that explains why it's there. And so the reason this is here is because in the key of G, that would have been 5. This would be 5-1 in the key of G. And so it's like giving this G chord its own personal 5 chord, which is exactly what I referred to in the, I guess it was the newsletter this week. This idea of what are called secondary dominants, giving other chords their own personal 5 chords. So we have G chord here, which is the 5 chord in the key of C. But if we give that G its own 5 chord, we temporarily pretend we're in the key of G, then the measure that came before that chord would be the 5 chord in the key of G. And this is how we notate it. 5/5. 5 of 5 is how we pronounce that. So it's the 5 chord in the key of the 5 chord. And what we will generally find is that a large number of the non-diatonic chords that we find, the chords that include accidentals, are going to be of that form. Whenever you see an accidental in a chord, take a look at the next measure, and chances are really good that what you're seeing is a 5-1 relationship in some other key. So we got our 5 chord here, and now, so check that out. This chord here, one of the cool things about having chosen this piece specifically is we get to hear a major 7th chord, and not just once, several times in this piece. We get to hear a major 7th chord, which is not like an everyday chord for Bach. It's not an everyday chord really for anyone prior to the late 19th century, really. That major 7th chord, you know, became a thing more in the Romantic era, and, of course, in jazz, it's huge. So Bach actually gives us a major 7 chord. So if you were to write the chord symbol for that, it would be C, MAJ7 or MA7, any of the abbreviations for major 7. Some people use just a triangle or triangle 7 for that, but that's really jazz slang, and I'm not, I won't recommend it. So we have an actual major 7th chord, and it does have the 7th in the bass, so calling it 1-4-2, absolutely correct. Then, so here also, Graham, you're calling this 6-7-5, and technically that's correct. Did sound go out for anyone else? Because I know Joanne mentioned sound. Does anyone else not have sound? Does anyone else? Not? Anyone else not? I have sound. So could someone just type in the chat to tell Elizabeth to try refreshing her screen? Because that often does it. If you do a refresh, that will fix it. So someone please type that in and suggest that to Elizabeth. And Joanne's having problems too. So yeah, I don't know what to say. Could be, yeah, could be server issues somewhere. But someone suggests that. And if refreshing the screen doesn't do it, actually leave and come back might do it also. Or just close the window and come back. Any of those might work. All right, so we have this chord here is indeed the 6th chord, right? It's built on scale degree 6. And it has a 7th in it, and it's in root position. So 6, 7 would be the way we would notate that. And just as with the 6-3, the 3 is just sort of understood. We don't typically put the 5 in there. Yes, there is a 7th and a 5th and a 3rd in that chord. So 7-5-3 would be the full name of that. But we never put 7-5-3, nor do we usually put 7-5. We just write 7. And then he's got 5 of 5. And here, 7 here, because this is an actual 7th chord. And then it goes to 5. So here, you know, we kind of have this motion into G again. Again, there's like a secondary dominant, 5 of 5 going to 5. And so anyhow, yeah, you've got a lot of right answers here. Now, the diminished chord is ones that you had asked about, and here is where I will tell you both my in the same way that those like D7 chords, I said I would just call it capital 2-7 and be okay with it without the whole secondary dominant 5 of 5. In order to be able to call it 5 of 5, you have to understand why it's there, and we haven't gone into that in much detail. That's what the harmony course does. So just calling it capital 2 is fine. It's definitely not going to pass muster if you're trying to pass a music theory exam, but it's definitely how musicians communicate. Yeah, dominant 2, we'll just say that, especially in the jazz and pop world. So diminished chords have their own language. So let's talk about what this chord is here. The first thing I want to point out is, yes, this is a diminished chord. It's got a G, a B flat, a C sharp, and an E, and that adds up to a diminished chord. The question is, which is the root of that chord? That's what I want to know. Which is the root of this diminished chord? If G were the root, it would be spelled G, B flat, D flat, F flat. Well, that's not the case, right? It's not how it's spelled. It's spelled G, B flat, C sharp, E. So what you have to do is, in your head, manually rearrange those notes to think about which spelling is Bach actually using here. What is the actual root of the chord? Because it's not going to be random. Bach is going to have chosen the spelling he did for a particular reason. So if I do that math in my head, I can see that C sharp is actually the root of that chord. C sharp, E, G, B flat. And I'm doing that by saying which arrangement gives me like every other letter, or, you know, line, 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 or space, 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 space. If I put the C sharp on the ledger line below the staff here, I'd have line, and then E on a line, and then G on a line, and then B flat above that on a line. It would be line, 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 top, bottom to top. So that is the spelling that gives me that. Or if you think about it in terms of letter names, it's C sharp, skip the D, E, skip the D, skip the F, G, skip the A, B flat. So you need to be able to rearrange those notes in your head to think about which one is the root. Now that I know C sharp is the root of that chord, now I can give it a name, and it's going to be 2. Sharp 1. Sharp 1. C sharp is sharp 1. So I would call this sharp 1 diminished. In fact, let me pop over and just put that in where it goes here. Is it right here? Yeah, right here. So if I put that in here, I would put sharp 1 diminished. Oh, and so sharp 1 diminished 7 if it were in root position, but now I have to think about which inversion it's in. It's the 5th is in the bass, so it's in 2nd inversion, and 2nd inversion for 7th chords is 4-3. So sharp 1, 4-3 would be the direct spelling of it, in the same way that capital 2 is the direct spelling of a D7 chord. So sharp 1 diminished 4-3 would be the answer that I would totally accept, and tons of musicians would use it. Nothing wrong with it per se, but it definitely isn't the full answer. The full answer here is the same type of notation that we use for secondary dominants, is to understand that the function of that sharp 1 diminished is the same as the function was of that D7. That D7 chord was there to get to G. This C sharp diminished chord is here to get to D minor. This is the 7 chord in the key of D minor. D minor has C sharp as its 7 chord. This is the 7 chord in the key of D minor. And in fact, D minor is the next chord. So instead of notating it that way as sharp 1 diminished, the more proper notation is 7 diminished 4/3 of 2. So it's the same type of notation that we use for secondary dominants. Now it's called secondary diminished. And if people are looking at this and going, whoa, you're making my head spin, that's okay. We haven't really talked about this much. I just have alluded to it, but this is what we get into much more in the harmony course. And I will do the harmony course with the same sort of step-by-step cohort-based approach, probably in the fall. Because I have a couple other things planned for the summer. So, yeah, as I keep seeing that people are having intermittent sound issues, and only thing I can tell you is they're still doing construction outside my office, road construction, and things are probably sporadic on my end, but I haven't noticed any issues on my end, so I'm not. Anyhow, it could be something with the signal going out. This C sharp diminished going to D minor is what's happening here. So I'm not going to then go through the rest of this chord by chord. I want to start talking about some more general things now. Oh, by the way, notice that there's some flags floating above their stems. Here, this is this particular version of the prelude here was created in MuseScore 2, and not even with the full version of MuseScore 2. It was actually started with like a beta version of MuseScore 2. So like we're talking 10 years ago. And so there's a number of things that kind of went wrong in the translation from 2 to 3. And I don't think anything additionally went wrong with the translation from 3 to 4, but definitely some things went wrong in the translation from 2 to 3. So if sound has been fine on at least one system, that proves that the issue is not at my end, for what it's worth. But if more than one person is happening, it's probably not all of your thing. It probably is some server in between us where it's where things are going funny. So what I want to do now is take a step back and look at a somewhat bigger picture here. The observation that I can say, I'm going to make a few observations, and you all feel definitely comment about this as well. Most of the chords here are diatonic, right? We've only had a couple of accidentals. We had that F sharp in that chord, which I've already explained as a secondary dominant. It's the 5 chord in the key of G, where G is the next chord, right? So we had that accidental, and then we had it again here. Again, it's like 5 to 1 in the key of G. So both of those accidentals that we've seen are basically examples of 5 to 1 types of thing. That circle of fifths is what is explaining those accidentals. Now, this one here, the diminished chord, that one is not circle of fifths. That's C sharp going to D. It's not circle of fifths. Or is it? So this is an observation. Again, I'm going to have a lesson on this in the final batch that comes out next week. But as a sneak peek, I want to make an observation here. If I take that C sharp diminished chord, and I'll leave off the 7th this time, just look at the triad here. Here's my C sharp diminished chord going to D minor. What if I put an A on the bottom of that? Now, that same C sharp diminished chord is an A7 chord. Well, that is the 5 chord in D minor. So anytime you hear C sharp going to D minor, or resolving this way, anytime you hear C sharp diminished resolving to D minor 7-1, you're really hearing 5-7 resolving to 1. That 7 chord, that diminished chord, is really just kind of substituting for a 5 chord. They're very similar sounds. And Bach kind of like tossed a coin. You know, sometimes he liked to use the 5 chord sound, and sometimes he liked to use the diminished chord sound. Especially in minor keys, he would use the diminished chord sound a lot, but, you know, use the 5 chord sound also. So often when you see that relationship, that 7 going to 1 relationship, it's really a 5-1 relationship. This is 7-1 in the key of D minor, but all I got to do is mentally add an A below it and go to D minor, and now it's 5-1. So what this really is it's telling me that 5-1 really is important, and the reason 7-1 sounds so good is that it sounds really a lot like 5-1. So yeah, and so that C sharp diminished is contained within the 5 chord. It's the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th of that 5 chord. So even though these accidentals aren't the accidentals, right? The accidentals here are not part of an actual 5-1 type of relationship. It's a 7-1 relationship, but it's like an honorary 5-1 because this sounds so much like an actual A chord with a flat 9 is what we would call this. So this week's lessons, we talked about flat 9s. If I put that A there, that B flat would be a flat 9. And don't think for a minute that Bach would not have done that, because he would have. Bach did actually put that note in there and call, you know, he would actually have used that, you know. In another piece, Bach totally would have done that. He just didn't do it here. So you're going to find the same thing is true of these other diminished chords. So Graham has this one notated as 4 diminished, and yes, F is scale degree 4, F, A flat, B, and D is a diminished chord, but F is not the root of it, because if it were, it would be spelled F, A flat. This note would be C flat, right? F, skip the G, A flat, skip the B, C flat is how that note would be spelled. It's not spelled C flat, it's spelled B. And then this guy would be E double flat. So it's definitely not an F diminished chord, because it would have been spelled very differently. If I do the same mental gymnastics of rearranging those notes to figure out which is the real root, we'll discover it's B. B, skip the D, skip the C, D, skip the E, F, skip the G, A flat. If we start on B, we get the right spelling. We get this spelling. So this is B diminished, and this is, again, going to be the 7 chord in the key of C, going to C. The 7 chord in the key of C wouldn't have that A flat. He's like saying, well, I'm going to pretend we're in C minor for a minute. We're going to borrow this note from C minor. This is all stuff we go into much more detail about in the harmony course. B diminished, fully diminished 7th chord like that would be the 7 chord in the key of C minor. And so he's kind of making you think, oh, we're going to go to C minor, but then he doesn't. He goes to C major. So if I actually play that the way he wrote it, it's B diminished to C major. And that's a really common thing also, to use that fully diminished 7 chord sound even in major keys. You definitely use it a lot in minor keys, but every once in a while in major keys you use it too. So what we're seeing here is that all the accidentals that we've encountered thus far are either part of these secondary dominants, meaning they are resolving down 5th, they're doing that circle of 5ths thing, or they're this diminished chord going up a step. B diminished going to C is going up a step. And again, if I imagine a G below it, now it's a G7 with a flat 9 in it, going to C. So that diminished chord sound is extremely related to the dominant 7th sound, because it's mostly the same notes. So even though 7-1 isn't technically the circle of 5ths, it might as well be. And then, you know, we get another lovely major 7th chord, right? And then we get 2, and then 5, then 1, which is like the jazz musician's dream chord progression, 2 to 5 to 1. And so this one, Graham, that you have marked 5-3, there is a 7th on this, so that's just 7. 5-3 would not be correct. It would be, you need to make sure you have the 7 on it. Then this guy is 5-7. 5 is optional. And then 1. And we don't even put the 5 or the 3 there. Just put 1. Just put 1. The 5 and 3 are both understood. So 2 to 5 to 1. Circle a 5th. D to G is down a 5th. G to C is, in this case, up a 4th, but same thing, down a 5th. That descending 5th or ascending 4th resolution has permeated this entire piece, right? We've got this entire piece, and it's all over the place. I didn't even point out all the other places where the circle of 5ths was happening. The beginning is 1 to 2, not circle of 5ths, but then 2 to 5 is circle of 5ths, and then from 5 to 1 is circle of 5ths, right? And then from A minor is that next measure, to D is circle of 5ths, to G is circle of 5ths, to C is circle of 5ths. So all the motions except 1 in this piece so far, except 2 in that piece so far to that point were circle of 5ths motions. And yeah, that's what we're going to find, just tons of circle of 5ths motion. And Stephen is observing something about the bass line, that it's descending, and this is definitely a the G fits the pattern. So which one are you talking about? You're talking about this guy. So yeah, the spelling of that G. Yeah, I'm not actually sure what you're saying, Stephen, about that, but I'm sure it makes sense. But the G is, yeah, you wouldn't have spelt it A double flat or some other weird spelling like that or anything. Yeah, Elizabeth, I have definitely said that anything 5 can do, 2-5 can do better. And sometimes I say vice versa also. So if you've got a whole measure of a 5 chord and you're like, gee, I wish there was something else going on here, instead of just playing 5 for 2 measures for the whole thing, you can go 2 to 5, 1. So, you know, it's a way of taking a single 5 chord and making something interesting happen. On the other hand, if you got a 2-5-1 and it's going by too fast to think about, just simplify it to 5. That works. They're kind of interchangeable. 5 and 2-5 are kind of interchangeable a little bit. So yeah, I've been wanting to like make these points about the circle of 5ths and how powerful the circle of 5ths is, but also talk about the idea of that most of this piece is diatonic. The non-diatonic chords, the ones with accidentals in them, exist for reasons, and mostly that reason is to do what we call tonicize the next chord, to create that 5-to-1 relationship or 7-to-1 relationship. If I keep skipping ahead to find our next accidental, it's this measure here. That is not a typo. This is indeed yet another major 7th that Bach's just like, man, I like that major 7th today. Because I have to imagine he wrote this in one day. You know, some of his pieces clearly would have taken longer to work out, but this one he probably whipped off in an hour. Although he revised it later, so what do you know? In any case, we have that B flat. This chord is not diatonic. And so spelling it just capital 1, 7 is totally fine. That's, again, how I do things. I would say dominant 1 and be happy with it. But the official notation for that is going to be that secondary dominant thing. The reason that chord exists is because it's the 5 chord in the key of F, right? So the fact that it's the 5 chord in the key of F is why it's there. And so we would notate this 5 of 4, V/1V, 5 of 4, or 5/7 of 4. And then we get some more of this diminished chord business. Now this diminished chord resolves to another diminished chord. That's like that's Bach being Bach. That's not like a common thing to have one diminished chord move immediately to another. It's not unheard of, but it's not like one of these things that you expect to see over and over and over again all over the place. It's like a special thing. So this is like the one place in the entire piece where something is going on that's not simple as far as all this kind of stuff goes. Graham, I'm glad you asked that because I was going to say something and then I forgot. So the question is, how would you differentiate the major seventh? Because what you've written here is 4/7, which to my jazz ear or eye or whatever, or ear, because I would say that out loud, a 4/7 chord. I would assume you meant a dominant seventh chord, which is quite common in jazz. Dominant 7/4 chords, super common. It's a blues thing. So we would actually say 4 major 7. In Roman numeral analysis, it gets a little trickier because in Roman numeral analysis, in a classical context, in the same way, if that had been a dominant seventh, we wouldn't have just written 4/7 because someone would look at it and go, well, wait a minute, why is a dominant seventh chord here? We would want to see, oh, it's 5 of this, or it's got some other reason to be there, and we would notate it in a way that makes it reason for existing clear. In classical analysis, we almost never just spell the chord in Roman numeral analysis if it's not diatonic. We give a reason for it, like that 5 of 5. So we would need to know a reason for a dominant seventh chord to exist here. So to a classical theorist, just seeing 5/7 might be enough to get them to say, oh, I guess he meant major 7. That's not universal though. I would write in MA. I would write in 4MA7. Some people would use a capital M for that. I'm never a fan of capital versus lowercase m to mean major and minor because they're too easy to mistake for each other. There's a tradition of it, but I'm not a fan. And in jazz, most people have gotten away from it. But in any case, you'd or MAJ. So 4MAJ7 would be another way of indicating that. So then we get into that whole pedal point section. All these chords are here. This guy here, what do we have here? We have this chord here that's a G, a D, and an F, but instead of a B in the middle like a normal 5 chord, it's got a C. It's got this. Well, if you use the terminology that I gave you in the course this week, this is a sus chord, G7 sus. Now, Roman numeral analysis wise, we don't put the word sus there. What we write is G7 4 and then a -3. So, and unfortunately it's like on 2 separate lines, so it's a little hard to notate exactly how that would be, but I'll give you an idea of it here. If I come here and write 5/7 4-3. Except that's not right. It's not the 3 should be lined up with the 4, and it's not. So I would just put the 5/7 and then 4 in this measure and then 3 in the next measure, because here is that third. B is the third. C is the fourth. B is the third. So the actual way you notate that is 5/7, and then also kind of as a separate thing from that, 4-3. In Roman numeral analysis, it's not real. In classical Roman numeral analysis, it's not necessary to indicate all those suspensions any more than it's necessary to indicate all the passing tones. They're not part of the chord. They are non-chord tones. So depending on who is asking you to do the analysis and why they're asking you to do it, they might not ever care to see that 4 in there. They might just say it's a 5/7 chord that happens to have a suspension in it, but whatever. But in chord symbol notation, this guy is G7 sus 4, which often we leave out the 4 and just call it G7 sus. Wow, did it just remove the 4? It got rid of the 4. Oh, because this is done in an older version in which, this was created in an older version of MuseScore in which if you type G7 sus 4, it would auto-correct it for you. That was a thing that existed for a while, that sort of auto-correct of chord symbols, and so it would remove those 4s for you, which I don't, I would rather keep the 4. If I type that 4, I want to keep the 4. So current versions of MuseScore will do that, but this was created in an older version. So, these are the things that I wanted to talk about with this. Once we hit that pedal point, you see that all these other chords start moving here. Then, again, we have a chord that's got too many notes in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's got 5 different notes in it. Well, that G is not part of the chord. This is an F sharp diminished chord. F sharp, A, C, E flat. That happens to have a G in the bass because it's part of that pedal point thing. So the chord symbol for this is F sharp diminished 7 / G. Oh yeah, and again, MuseScore, the beta version of MuseScore 2 it was using, won't like that chord symbol spelled that way. But F sharp diminished 7 / G is how you do that in chord symbols. In Roman numeral analysis, it's just whatever F sharp is, I could call it sharp 4 diminished, sharp 4 diminished 7. Diminished 7, and somewhere you would indicate pedal, like 5 pedal. You'd indicate that sort of separately. So is there a standard way to write chord symbols? Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of different ways to write chord symbols. And so it varies by region, varies by genre of music, varies by, era, like people in the 60s wrote chords different than people in the 80s versus now. So unfortunately, there's a lot of different ways that chord symbol notation works. I allude to that in the lesson in the course about chord symbols, but I don't go into detail into every possible way that chord symbols can be spelt. Because there's just so many of them. I just put forth the ones that I think are worth knowing. But yeah, this thing where this 266F, that's just that's because this file, again, was created in a beta version of MuseScore 2, and it has all this weird stuff in it that is no longer a thing. And so if you used any of that weird stuff, you get this weird thing here. So yeah, that won't happen in your scores. I don't know. This is a lot to sort of go through in this piece, but what you see is there's a lot of things we see over and over and over again. And those things that we see over and over again are really common, right? The fact that we have this circle of fifths motion, we have those secondary dominants, those sort of 5-1 in other keys, or that 7-1 in other keys. The question that Graham is asking now about this diminished chord, I had mentioned there's 2 diminished chords in a row. Then, right, this is clearly a diminished chord, and you are calling it one. This is a diminished chord, F sharp, C, A, and E flat, and F sharp is indeed the root of this, F, A, C, and E flat. That is an F sharp diminished chord. So the notation for that would be sharp 4 diminished. This guy here, A flat, F, B, C, and D. Well, that's too many notes. Again, that's 5 notes. One of those is not in the chord. This is like the one other place where that happens other than the pedal point. C is our odd man out. C is there to give us a little melodic line. He just felt like going stepwise. The C is what's called a passing tone. It's there to connect the B to the D smoothly. Everywhere else he's got arpeggios, right? He's moving in little leaps. Here he just felt like having steps. He felt like bringing, because he really wanted that E flat to come down to D. This E flat. He wanted that E flat coming down to D, yet he also wanted, other notes. He wanted that A to go up to the B, and then that kind of squished the C in the middle there. So he kept that C in the middle, even though it's not in the chord. So that's what's called a passing tone. Most pieces would have a ton of passing tones. This piece doesn't have many passing tones at all. It's one of the very few in the entire piece, and it's because the whole piece is built on arpeggios. That's highly unusual for the entire piece to be built on arpeggios like that. Extremely unusual. Usually there's a mixture of arpeggiated things and more scalar passages, but this piece is almost completely devoid of scalar passages. It's all about connecting the notes in the arpeggio. And he's connecting the top note of each chord, the second to top note, they're all connecting smoothly, so he's getting smooth motion, but he's not actually playing, having you play little passages of scales. He's not actually having you play steps other than this measure. So I'll talk more about passing tones in one of next week's lessons also. So for measure 23, this, first of all, so once we know that C is the passing tone, we omit it and don't think about it. We're not going to notate it. Then we just need to know, well, this is a diminished chord. Where is its root? And I have to do my mental arithmetic of respelling the notes. And I can do this in my head because I've done it enough times. I know it's B diminished. B, skip the C. D, skip the E. F, skip the G. A flat. That is, if B is on the bottom, we get the right spelling. If you try to put any other note on the bottom, you're going to end up with double flats and weird things like that. B is the one, B diminished is the spelling of this. So this is basically 7 diminished. And it has the 7th in the bass. So 7 diminished 4-2 would be the correct spelling of that chord. 7 diminished. 7 diminished 4-2. So the reason I picked this piece is because it's so much based on the arpeggios, we can just look at the chords and figure out what they are. If we were to look at other music that wasn't just, and I wish I could get to, well, we'll look at my theme music because it's about time to wrap up anyhow. I mean, I could do a harmonic analysis of this piece also, and so could you, and you might want to try it. But if I do that on this piece, B on the top, E, and this note here is also an E, and then the cello has the G sharp. That's the first chord. Well, we could look at that and go, oh, that's an E chord. E, G sharp, B in first inversion. This piece is in A minor, so that's 5-6. The 5 chord in first inversion, resolving to A and that. It's an A, another A, an E, and a C. That's the 1 chord, lowercase 1 because it's minor. So we have 5-6 to 1, and then we have this, which is an A7 chord, A, C sharp, E, and G. So this is a 1, capital 1, 4-2, the 7th chord in third inversion, 7th in the bass. But again, when we have non-diatonic chords, we want to know why it's there. And the reason is this A7 is the 5 chord in the key of D minor. And D minor is indeed the next chord, right? So we again have that circle of fifths relationship. So at the beginning, we could look at those chords one at a time. But gee, once we get to letter A, once we get to all this business here, now we got all these other notes. We can't anymore easily figure out, well, wait a minute, which chord is which here and what are these extra notes going here? So in order to do that sort of analysis, that's when we need to study my counterpoint course, basically. So, and the harmony course will give you some insight into that as well. So, but the Bach prelude was a good opportunity to just practice spelling the chords and putting Roman numerals to them without the distraction of all the passing tones and scalar passages and stuff that a piece like this has. So we're going to wrap up here. And I want to thank everyone for being here. Thanks for the discussion. Thanks for the observations posted in the community, the questions here, the questions in the community. By all means, anyone who hasn't gone through this, feel free to go through yourself on that prelude and see what else you can figure out. And really look at that circle of fifths thing. Really try to get an appreciation for just how prevalent that circle of fifths motion is. Yeah, these are all things you want to get an appreciation for so that as we move into the harmony course, you're like, okay, I see what we're going for, because it's about establishing that and then going beyond. So I'm really looking forward to doing that again, probably in the fall. So next week, we'll be wrapping this up. So we'll have some final stuff to talk about, more about chords, more about making melody and the relationships between the two. Really looking forward to that. Thanks everyone for being part of this. See you all next time.